The pickles in your refrigerator are probably dead. Not spoiled, sterilized, boiled, and stripped of the billions of living bacteria that made a pickle for 6,000 years. The label still says pickle, and legally, that's completely fine. Here's the simple explanation. Vinegar is faster, cheaper, and safer than fermentation, so the industry switched. Except that creates a problem nobody in the business likes discussing. What vinegar replaced wasn't a flavor, it was a survival technology. Preserved vegetables kept armies moving, and Caesar's soldiers ate them believing it made them stronger. Sailors who ate pickled cabbage survived voyages that killed half the crew on ships without it. Amerigo Vespucci, the man America is named after, sold pickled provisions to ocean expeditions before he ever mapped a coastline. So it sounds obvious. Pickling was a miracle, and vinegar was progress. That's exactly where the story falls apart. For most of human history, nobody knew why pickling worked, and that ignorance killed people. Victorian grocers dyed pickles bright green using copper sulfate to make them look fresher. Copper sulfate is poison. Other batches carried botulism, one of the deadliest toxins on Earth, and doctors couldn't explain the bodies. Then a man named Heinz turned pickles into an empire, with clear glass jars and a free pin he gave away 1,000,000 times. He wasn't selling food, he was selling proof that he wasn't hiding anything. And none of that is the strangest part of this story. Scientists are now digging through old fermentation brines, hunting microbes that may influence the immune system, mood, and antibiotic resistance. The same microbes modern factories deliberately destroy. Which leaves one very uncomfortable question. If humans spent thousands of years perfecting this, why did we abandon it in a single century? And who made that decision for us? If an ordinary jar of pickles has been hiding a story this strange, imagine what else is sitting in your kitchen. Subscribe because the next one is even harder to believe. Start with the word itself, because the word is already lying to you. In America, a pickle means one thing, a cucumber sitting in brine. But pickling was never about cucumbers, and the cucumber shows up embarrassingly late in the story. Our word comes from the Dutch pekkel, which didn't mean a food at all. It meant the salty liquid, the brine, the solution, the thing doing the work. The food was almost an afterthought. Pekkel was the technology, and anything you dropped into it became preserved. Which means a pickle isn't an object, a pickle is a process. And that process has been applied to almost everything humans eat. Once you see it that way, the kitchen starts looking strange. Sauerkraut is a pickle. Kimchi is a pickle. Olives are pickles, and so are capers, which are just flower buds nobody could eat otherwise. Yogurt, cheese, salami, soy sauce, fish sauce, miso, sourdough bread, Tabasco sauce, and even the beans behind your coffee and chocolate all rely on the same basic trick. That trick is controlled decay. You are not stopping food from breaking down. You are choosing which organisms get to break it down and starving everything else. Here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. The bacteria that turn a cucumber into a pickle were never added by anyone. They are already living on the surface of the vegetable when you pull it out of the ground. All salt does is create conditions where those specific bacteria thrive while the dangerous ones suffocate. The bacteria eat sugars in the vegetable and produce lactic acid. The acid builds up, the environment turns hostile, and nothing that could hurt you can survive in it. Humans didn't invent that chemistry, they just learned to trigger it. And they learned to do it thousands of years before anyone knew bacteria existed. That gap is the part historians still struggle to explain properly. Ancient people were running precise microbiology experiments with no concept of microbes. Get the salt ratio wrong by a small amount, and the batch spoils, or worse, becomes poisonous. Get it right, and food lasts through an entire winter. There was no theory behind any of it, no explanation anyone could write down that would be true. There was only inherited instruction, passed from one generation to the next, sometimes wrapped in religion, sometimes in superstition, always guarded carefully. Families in some regions treated brine recipes as inheritance, more valuable than land. Now consider the olive, because the olive quietly proves how essential this was. A fresh olive straight off the tree is basically inedible. It contains a compound called oleuropein that makes it painfully bitter, and no amount of chewing fixes it. The only way to make an olive food is to cure it in salt, water, or lye over weeks. So an entire agricultural civilization built around olives, olive oil, and olive trade only existed because somebody figured out how to remove a poison-like bitterness using salt water and patience. Nobody knows who. The olive was already domesticated before anyone thought to write about it. This is the pattern that keeps appearing. The most repeated origin story you'll find claims pickling began in Mesopotamia, in the Tigris Valley, around 4,000 years ago. That line has been copied into cookbooks and articles for decades, always with the same confident tone. Dig for the original evidence, and it thins out fast. The date gets repeated because it's convenient, not because a definitive pickle jar was excavated with a receipt inside. And the deeper problem is structural. Preserved food almost never survives for archaeologists to find. Pottery survives, bones survive. Brine evaporates and vegetables rot into nothing. We are trying to date an invention that deliberately leaves no remains. Which means every date you've heard is a floor, not a ceiling. The evidence can only ever tell us how late pickling might have started, never how early. Meanwhile, something else keeps showing up in the record. Fermentation appears independently on nearly every inhabited continent, among people who never met and never traded. Korea developed it, Egypt developed it, the Andes developed it, Northern Europe, West Africa, China, Japan, and the Pacific Islands all developed versions of it. Isolated groups, different climates, different crops, same underlying discovery. That doesn't look like an invention spreading along a route. That looks like something humans stumble into everywhere, given enough time and enough salt. There's a stranger possibility hiding in that. Fermentation doesn't require farming. It doesn't require pottery, cities, writing, or metal tools. It requires food, water, salt, or a sealed container, and the willingness to eat something that smells slightly wrong. Hunter-gatherers had all of that. Some researchers now argue that early humans were eating fermented meat, fish, and fruit long before anybody planted a seed on purpose. There's even a theory that fermented food helped fuel our oversized brains, because fermentation pre-digests food and unlocks calories our stomachs couldn't reach alone. If that's true, the standard timeline is backwards. We've always been told the story runs in one direction. Humans learned to farm. Farming created surplus. Surplus needed storage. Storage produced preservation. Pickling arrives at the end as a clever solution to a new problem. But preservation may have come first, and farming may have only become worth doing because we already knew how to keep what we grew from rotting. That flips the entire question. Because if humans were preserving food before they were growing it, then the real mystery isn't who made the first pickle. It's what these people already understood about the invisible world thousands of years before science existed to explain it. and how much of that knowledge we've since forgotten completely. The trail doesn't start where most food histories say it does. It starts in southern Sweden, in a shallow pit lined with pine bark and sealed with seal fat. Inside, archaeologists found the bones of thousands of fish, packed tight and deliberately buried. The site is around 9,000 years old, which puts it before farming reached the region. These were hunter-gatherers, people we're told lived hand to mouth, and yet they were storing food on an industrial scale. There was no salt in the pit, and that detail changed everything researchers thought they understood. Without salt, the fish would have fermented in its own bacteria, in cold ground, slowly turning acidic instead of rotten. It's the same principle behind a jar of pickles, discovered thousands of years before anyone planted a seed. That single site breaks the standard story of civilization. We're usually taught that farming created surplus and surplus created cities. But preservation had to come first, because a harvest you can't store is just a very good week. Fermentation was the technology that let humans hold on to time itself. And here's what makes it strange. Nobody could see how it worked. The people doing this had no idea that bacteria existed, no concept of acid, no way to test anything. They were managing invisible organisms by feel, by smell, by rules passed down through generations that nobody could explain. The chemistry behind it is almost embarrassingly simple. The bacteria you need are already sitting on the surface of the vegetable, especially lactic acid bacteria that thrive without oxygen. Put a cucumber in salty water and seal it away from air, and you've eliminated nearly every organism that could make it dangerous. The salt slows the harmful microbes down. Then, the lactic acid bacteria take over and flood the brine with acid. Once the acidity drops below a certain point, almost nothing else can survive in there. Ancient people weren't preserving food so much as choosing which microbes would win. The first written evidence of deliberate pickling shows up in Mesopotamia on clay tablets listing preserved foods among temple supplies. Cucumbers themselves weren't local. They came from India, carried west along early trade routes long before anyone drew a map. That's an important detail because the cucumber was traveling before it was famous. Somewhere between the Indus Valley and the Tigris, it met salt water and became something else entirely. In India, the same instinct produced a completely different result because they had oil, mustard, and heat instead of cold ground, and achar was preserved in oil and spice rather than brine. Egypt took the idea somewhere darker. Egyptians pickled food, and preserved jars have turned up in tombs, but they applied the same chemistry to human bodies. Mummification relied on natron, a natural salt that pulled water out of tissue until bacteria had nothing left to feed on. It's the exact mechanism behind a salt-cured cucumber. The people who built the pyramids understood osmosis in practice, centuries before anyone had a word for it, and they used it on both dinner and the dead. China developed the technology on a scale that dwarfed everyone else. Workers on early sections of the Great Wall were fed fermented vegetables, sometimes soured in rice wine, because you can't feed an enormous labor force with fresh produce. This is where pickling stops being a household habit and becomes state infrastructure. An army or a work crew is only as strong as its food supply, and preserved vegetables meant a government could concentrate tens of thousands of people in one place for years. Salt became the pressure point, and Chinese rulers noticed early. The state's salt monopoly became one of the most reliable sources of government revenue in human history, funding armies through a tax on the one ingredient nobody could refuse to buy. There's a myth that Roman soldiers were paid in salt, which is where the word salary supposedly comes from. The word connection is real, but the payment story isn't. soldiers were paid in coin, and salt was simply so central to military supply that it worked its way into the language. What the Romans genuinely did rely on was preserved food to hold an empire together. Legions carried sour rations, and fish sauce made from fermented fish guts became the most traded flavoring in the Mediterranean. That sauce was made in coastal factories, aged in vats for months, and shipped in clay containers across thousands of miles. Rome ran partly on controlled decay. Korea pushed the idea into something closer to art, burying earthenware jars in the ground so the temperature stayed steady through brutal winters. That buried jar shows up again and again across the world. In Japan with rice bran, in Eastern Europe with cabbage barrels, in the Middle East with lemons. Cultures with no contact whatsoever kept arriving at the same answer, and they all landed on the same specific solution of sealing a vessel and putting it underground. Then there's the part nobody has fully explained. Fermented vegetables don't just survive, they improve. Fermentation creates B vitamins that weren't there before, and it makes minerals easier for the body to absorb. Cabbage that has soured holds on to vitamin C far longer than cabbage that hasn't. Ancient people had no way of knowing any of this, yet across continents, they consistently chose to ferment the specific foods that gained the most nutritional value from it. Nobody can say how that knowledge was found, or how many failed attempts came first, because the failures didn't leave records. What they left instead was a technology sitting in a jar, waiting for someone to realize it could be loaded onto a ship. Once people learned to preserve food, the real fight became about who controlled the salt. Preserving anything at scale took enormous amounts of it, and salt was not evenly spread across the world. Rome built entire roads to move it, and the Via Salaria existed for one purpose: hauling salt inland from the coastal flats. Whoever sat on a salt supply suddenly held power over everyone downstream who wanted to eat in winter. In China, the state figured this out early and turned salt into a government monopoly that lasted, on and off, for over 2,000 years. At certain points, taxes on salt paid for more than half the imperial budget. That money helped fund armies, canals, and defensive walls, all because vegetables needed brine to survive until spring. The same logic played out in Europe, just with different winners. The city of Venice grew rich partly by controlling salt shipments across the Adriatic, and it treated the trade like a weapon. Merchants were legally required to bring salt back on returning ships, and the profits subsidized the rest of Venetian commerce. Farther north, the Hanseatic League built its fortune on a similar arrangement, moving salt from inland German mines toward the fishing ports of the Baltic. The fish there was the real prize, because Catholic Europe had a huge structural demand for preserved fish that nobody talks about anymore. On fast days, meat was forbidden, and depending on the calendar, that covered well over 100 days a year. That religious rule created one of the largest food economies in medieval Europe. Millions of people needed something salted, brined, or pickled to get through Lent and every Friday in between. A Dutch fisherman named Willem Boykelzoon is credited with refining a method for gutting and barreling herring at sea, which meant the fish went into brine while still fresh. Amsterdam grew so wealthy off that trade that people used to say the city was built on herring bones. The Dutch also gave us the word itself, from their term pekkel, meaning brine, which then became pickle in English. Meanwhile, the same idea had already spread east along the trade routes, and each culture bent it into something different. In Korea, brined and seasoned vegetables became a system for surviving winters where nothing grew, and villages stored jars underground where temperatures stayed steady. In Japan, salted plums traveled with soldiers because the acid was thought to fight exhaustion and stop the water in a canteen from going bad. Indian pickles took a completely different path, using oil, mustard, and spices instead of relying only on salt and water. These traditions developed independently, but they all landed on the same underlying trick, which is one of the strangest patterns in food history. Then came the moment that changed the destiny of preserved food permanently, and it happened on a ship. Long ocean voyages had a horrifying casualty rate, and the killer was scurvy. Crews lost teeth, opened old wounds, and died within weeks of running out of fresh food. On some routes, a captain expected to lose a third of the men before reaching port. Naval officers argued for generations about what caused it, and most of them blamed bad air, dirty living conditions, or laziness. James Cook, on his first Pacific voyage, took a large quantity of sauerkraut and enforced a daily ration. His men resisted it, so he used a trick that says a lot about human nature. He served it only at the officers' table for a few days, and once the crew saw the officers enjoying something exclusive, they demanded their share. Cook crossed the Pacific and lost nobody to scurvy, which at the time was almost unbelievable. The voyage became evidence that preserved cabbage did something no doctor could explain. But here's the part that gets skipped. Nobody understood the mechanism, so the wrong lesson got learned. Fermented cabbage retains some vitamin C, but the amount depends on how it's made and how long it sits. The Navy eventually switched to citrus juice, then switched suppliers to a cheaper lime that had far less vitamin C, and scurvy quietly came back decades later. An entire scientific breakthrough was accidentally undone because nobody knew which ingredient was doing the work. Still, the naval discovery changed everything about how preserved vegetables were valued. Ships stopped treating them as cheap filler and started treating them as strategic supplies. Barrels of brined cabbage and cucumbers were loaded alongside gunpowder and rope because they extended how far a fleet could operate before turning back. Exploration itself became limited by preservation technology, and empires expanded roughly as far as their food could survive. That expansion carried the cucumber around the world at incredible speed. Columbus brought cucumbers to Hispaniola specifically so future voyages could grow and pickle their own supply. Dutch settlers later planted cucumber fields around New Amsterdam, and the area kept that reputation long after it became New York. Brooklyn eventually became a pickle district so dense that whole streets smelled of brine, staffed largely by immigrant families selling from barrels. And that is where the story stops being about survival and starts being about money. Because once preserved food became a strategic asset with a guaranteed market, people found ways to fake it, stretch it, and cut corners on it. The moment there was profit in a barrel of pickles, someone realized that customers had no way to test what was actually in the brine. For most of the 19th century, the most dangerous food in a British household was probably the pickle jar. Not because of what grew inside it, but because of what grocers put in on purpose. Customers had decided that a good pickle should be vivid green, so sellers gave them vivid green, using copper sulfate and copper acetate stirred straight into the brine. Copper reacts with the plant tissue and locks in a bright emerald color that vinegar alone can never produce. It also accumulates in the liver and kidneys, and in large enough doses, it kills. A chemist named Frederick Accume published a book exposing this trade, with a skull on the cover and the title, "There is Death in the Pot." He named actual shops and actual names, which was almost unheard of, and the food industry destroyed his career within a few years. He was accused of tearing pages out of library books, disgraced, and driven out of England entirely. The practice did not stop when Accume left. Decades later, a doctor named Arthur Hill Hassel began putting London groceries under a microscope for a medical journal, and pickles came back as one of the worst offenders. Along with copper, sellers were adding alum to keep vegetables firm, because a soft pickle looked old and a crisp one looked fresh. Some recipe books of the era openly recommended boiling pickles in copper pans to improve the color, treating poison as a cooking technique. Housewives were following instructions that were slowly damaging their families, and nobody could see it happening. That was the real weakness of preserved food. Everything that made it safe was invisible, and so was everything that made it deadly. Which brings up the thing that had been quietly killing people for far longer than copper ever did. Preserved food occasionally produced a paralysis that doctors could not explain at all. Victims stayed fully conscious while their eyelids drooped, their throats stopped working, and eventually their lungs failed. A German physician named Justinus Kerner documented dozens of these cases from preserved sausage and became convinced there was some unknown fat poison involved. He was wrong about the mechanism, but right about the pattern, and the disease still carries his sausage clue in its name. Botulism comes from the Latin word for sausage. The actual culprit, identified after a funeral dinner in a Belgian village left musicians dead and paralyzed, was a bacterium that thrives in exactly the conditions preserving jars create. No oxygen, low acid, room temperature, sealed tight. This is the part that makes the whole history of pickling much stranger than it first appears. Real fermentation is actually one of the safest things you can do to a vegetable, because the acid it produces is hostile to almost everything dangerous, including botulism. The danger arrived when people started sealing food in jars and cans without understanding acidity at all. Home canning killed families across America and Europe for decades. California's olive industry nearly collapsed after sealed, low-acid olives poisoned diners in several states, and dozens died. The safe, old method had been replaced by a modern method that looked cleaner, sealed tighter, and quietly turned jars into incubators. Then the deception moved from color into chemistry. Manufacturers began dosing food with preservatives like borax, salicylic acid, and benzoate of soda, which let them ship cheaper produce longer distances. A government chemist named Harvey Washington Wiley started testing these substances on human volunteers, young men who agreed to eat measured doses at government tables, and the press nicknamed them the Poison Squad. Some got violently ill. And here is the twist. The man who took Wiley's side against his own industry was Henry Heinz, the Pickle King. He backed federal food regulation because clean rules would wipe out competitors who cheated. The birth of modern food safety in America was partly a business strategy dressed up as morality, and it worked. Heinz got the law, and Heinz got the market. Meanwhile, the political side of preservation was doing damage on a much larger scale. Since pickling depends on salt, whoever controlled salt controlled who could store food through a bad season. France taxed salt through the gabelle so aggressively that smuggling became a mass criminal industry, and resentment fed directly into revolution. In India, British salt laws made it illegal for people living beside the ocean to collect their own salt, which meant poor families could not afford to preserve fish or vegetables at all. Gandhi understood exactly how symbolic that was when he walked to the sea to pick up a handful of it. A tax on preservation is a tax on survival, and empires knew it. The last dark turn is more recent, and it came from science rather than fraud. As researchers mapped stomach cancer rates around the world, they kept finding the highest numbers in regions with the strongest pickling traditions, particularly parts of East Asia. Heavily salted preserved vegetables appear to damage the stomach lining and help harmful compounds form, and international health agencies eventually listed salt-preserved vegetables as a possible cause of cancer. The technology that had kept humanity alive through winter was now sitting on a warning list. That contradiction is genuinely unresolved, because the same jars also produce compounds that look protective. And it explains why the industry was already looking for a way to make pickles without fermentation, without risk, and without any living thing inside them at all. The transformation of the pickle didn't begin in a kitchen. It began with a piece of glass and a screw thread. A tinsmith named John Landis Mason patented a jar with a threaded neck and a rubber-sealed lid, and suddenly, ordinary families could seal food at home reliably. But the real revolution was that the jar was transparent. In an era when grocers sold pickles out of open wooden barrels on the floor, being able to see the food inside was a genuine selling point. And one man understood that better than anyone else alive. Henry Heinz didn't invent pickles, and he didn't invent the jar either. What he invented was the idea that food should be sold in packaging that proves nothing is being hidden. His competitors bought cheap barrel pickles and hid the murky brine. Heinz put his product in clear glass, kept the color natural, and let people inspect it. Then he did something no food seller had ever tried. He opened his factories to public tours, showed visitors the spotless floors, and paid his workers to look clean and healthy. Food safety wasn't regulated yet, so Heinz turned transparency itself into advertising. His most famous stunt was almost an accident. At the Chicago World's Fair, his booth was stuck on a nearly empty upper floor. So he printed small cards promising a free souvenir and scattered them across the fairgrounds. The souvenir was a tiny green pickle pin made of gutta percha, worth almost nothing. The crowds were so heavy that engineers reportedly had to reinforce the balcony. Heinz gave away millions of those pins over the following decades, and that little charm became one of the most recognized promotional objects in American history. He was selling a vegetable in vinegar, and he made people wear it as jewelry. That same instinct pushed him into politics in a way nobody expected from a pickle manufacturer. When the federal government moved to regulate food additives, most of the industry fought back hard because chemical preservatives like sodium benzoate were cheap and let sloppy producers sell inferior goods. Heinz did the opposite. He funded his own research lab, proved he could preserve pickles and ketchup using only vinegar, salt, and quality ingredients, then lobbied in favor of the law that would strangle his competition. The Pure Food and Drug Act passed, and one of the most important consumer protection laws in American history was pushed forward, partly by a man who profited from it enormously. So the pickle got safer, cleaner, and more trusted. And then the industry quietly removed the one thing that had defined it for thousands of years. Real fermentation is slow and unpredictable. Cucumbers sit in salt brine tanks for weeks while bacteria do the work. Temperatures shift. Batches go soft. Entire tanks are lost. So processors developed what they call fresh pack or quick pack pickles. Cucumbers go into hot vinegar brine, get sealed, get pasteurized, and ship the same day. No fermentation at all. The flavor is imitated with acid, sugar, dill oil, and spices, and pasteurization kills whatever microbes might still be alive. The results are so convincing that most people have never tasted a fermented pickle in their lives without realizing what they were missing. Even the crunch is manufactured. Old producers used alum to firm up softened cucumbers, and modern ones commonly use calcium chloride, a firming salt that hardens plant cell walls. The bright color often comes from turmeric or added dyes, including yellow food coloring in some dill products. Every trait people associate with a fresh pickle is now an additive. Then, a hamburger changed the cucumber itself. As fast food scaled up, buyers needed pickle slices with identical diameter, identical thickness, and skin tough enough to survive machinery and a hot patty without turning to mush. Breeders responded by developing cucumbers with thicker skins, denser flesh, and uniform shapes. Mechanical harvesters made it stranger still, because the machine rips the entire plant out of the ground in one pass. That means every cucumber on the vine has to be ready at the same moment, so plants were bred to ripen simultaneously. The vegetable was redesigned to suit a machine. Marketing did the final layer of work, and this is where the myths start collapsing. A kosher dill has nothing to do with religious certification unless a symbol says so, because in the pickle trade, kosher simply came to mean the garlicky New York Jewish deli style. Bread and butter pickles were not named for a sandwich, but reportedly because a farming couple bartered their sweet pickles for staples like bread and butter, then trademarked the name. And the pickles sold in the refrigerated section, marketed as fresher and crunchier than the shelf ones, are usually not fermented either. They're vinegar pickles that skip pasteurization and stay cold instead, which preserves texture, not living cultures. War accelerated all of it. During the Second World War, the United States government directed a huge share of commercial pickle production to feed troops, because pickles delivered salt, calories, and morale in a package that survived shipping. Rationing at home made pickles scarce, and the industry used patriotic advertising to keep demand high while supply was gone. When soldiers came back, they came back with the taste already installed. Meanwhile, the growing shifted continents. Much of the world's gherkin supply now comes from India, largely from farms in the south, quietly exported to Europe and beyond. Somebody eating a jar in Germany, convinced they're eating a local tradition, is usually eating cucumbers grown thousands of miles away. And underneath the marketing sat a physical problem nobody advertised. Fermentation tanks produce enormous volumes of salty wastewater, and salt cannot simply be filtered out. Whole factory towns had to deal with brine they couldn't safely dump, which gave companies one more reason to abandon fermentation entirely. The switch wasn't really about flavor or safety. It was about time, machinery, and waste. Which means the modern pickle is not an improved version of the original. It's a recreation of its appearance, engineered backwards from what a factory can produce cheaply. And that raises something far more unsettling than lost flavor. Because what was thrown out of those brine tanks may have been doing something to human bodies that nobody thought to measure until it was already gone. The strangest thing about pickles today is that science had to rediscover what your great-grandmother already knew. For most of the 20th century, nutritionists treated fermented vegetables as junk. Too salty, low in calories, nutritionally pointless. Then researchers at Stanford ran a simple experiment where one group ate fermented foods for 10 weeks. Their gut bacteria became measurably more diverse, and 19 different markers of inflammation in their blood went down. The control group ate high-fiber food instead and got none of the same effect. Nobody expected that, because fiber was supposed to be the hero of gut health. It turned out the living microbes were doing something fiber alone could not do. That discovery sent scientists back to old brine barrels, and what they found there was almost embarrassing. A single spoonful of properly fermented sauerkraut can contain more live bacteria than an entire commercial probiotic capsule. Some of those strains produce compounds that kill off harmful bacteria without touching helpful ones, which is exactly the kind of targeted weapon modern medicine desperately needs. There are labs now screening wild pickle bacteria for antibiotic candidates because the strains have spent thousands of years competing in salty, acidic environments. They are, in a sense, veterans of a microbial war we never noticed. Then the whole picture got confusing again. In 2020, microbiologists formally split the genus Lactobacillus into 25 separate genera because genetic sequencing revealed those bacteria were never one close family at all. Species that looked nearly identical under a microscope turned out to be as different from each other as cats are from dogs. Which means much of the older research on fermented food was studying organisms it had misidentified for decades. We are still learning the names of the things that have been preserving our food since before writing existed. Meanwhile, the industry has its own quiet complications. If you have ever wondered why a factory pickle stays hard while a homemade one goes soft, the answer is usually calcium chloride, sometimes called a firming agent on the label. For generations before that, producers used alum, which works by binding to the cucumber's cell walls. Bright yellow color often comes from added turmeric or approved dyes, because vinegar brine alone produces a duller, less appetizing shade. None of it is dangerous, but almost none of it is fermentation either. It is engineering designed to imitate a biological process. There is also a problem the industry rarely advertises, and it involves what happens to all that salt. A large pickling plant produces enormous volumes of salty wastewater, and salt cannot simply be filtered out the way solids can. It passes through most treatment systems, builds up in soil, and damages freshwater ecosystems downstream. Some operations now reuse brine repeatedly to reduce the load, which is technically a return to older methods just for environmental reasons instead of economic ones. The oldest preservation technology on Earth turns out to have a disposal problem nobody solved. The crops themselves are in trouble too. Pickling cucumbers were hit hard when a fungal disease called downy mildew broke through the resistance that had protected them for roughly 40 years. Growers who had barely thought about the disease suddenly lost entire fields, and breeders have been racing to catch up ever since. Warmer, wetter seasons help the pathogen spread faster, which means the humble cucumber has quietly become a climate story. Most American pickling cucumbers come from a surprisingly small number of regions, so a bad year in one place moves prices everywhere. And then there is the health contradiction nobody likes to explain. While researchers celebrate fermented vegetables for gut health, the World Health Organization's Cancer Agency lists certain traditional salt-preserved vegetables as possibly carcinogenic. Populations that historically ate very large amounts of heavily salted preserved vegetables show higher rates of stomach cancer. The likely culprit is not fermentation itself, but the sheer salt load, plus compounds that can form in poorly controlled preservation. So the same food can genuinely help you and genuinely hurt you depending on how much salt comes with it and how it was made. That nuance almost never survives a headline. What has definitely been lost is the human part. In Japan, some families maintained rice bran fermentation beds that were fed and tended daily, passed down like furniture, occasionally for over a century. The bacteria inside those beds were effectively a family heirloom, and when the household stopped, that specific microbial population ended forever. In Korea, the communal autumn kimchi-making tradition became so culturally important that UNESCO added it to its heritage list, partly because it was fading as people bought factory kimchi instead. In India, mango pickle recipes were once tuned to individual households, with proportions nobody wrote down. Refrigerators did not just replace pickling, they made the knowledge unnecessary. And unnecessary knowledge disappears within about 2 generations. Which brings the story back to that jar in the refrigerator door. It is not fake food, and it is not a scam. It is the final product of a very long negotiation between humans and time, in which we slowly traded away the living part of preservation for consistency, safety, and shelf stability. For thousands of years, a pickle was proof that a family could survive a winter. Now it is a garnish. The real invention was never the cucumber or the vinegar or even the salt. It was the discovery that decay could be aimed, managed, and turned into an ally, and that a bucket of brine could buy a civilization enough time to build something permanent. Every empire that stored food outlasted the ones that could not. The oddest part is how completely we forgot. The technology that made cities possible now sits between the ketchup and the mustard, and almost nobody who opens that jar knows they are holding the oldest surviving invention in the kitchen.